Good morning. Welcome to our webinar today. It's a beautiful day in Virginia. It's a beautiful day in Atlanta, where I am, and it's a beautiful day all over the world. We're pleased that you can join us for this webinar. Today, we're going to be discussing in our third in the Crisis Coach webinar series, when others know more than you do.
Ken, if you mute your phone for the moment, I think we're getting the feedback through your computer. Go ahead, Bill.
Okay. If you could change the slide.
All right.
There we go. We'd also like to become our friend. Facebook, we're Firestorm Solutions. You can follow us on Twitter at Firestorm Soul. There is a hashtag. That hashtag is Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risk and crises. Firestorm expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. We'd like to remind you that the presentation today is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion. And the work product that we present must be read and considered in conjunction with advice from your organization's personal counsel. In addition, this information should not be interpreted as legal advice or legal opinion. Firestorm is delighted to have this series underwritten by the Virginia Association of Independent Schools. This is the third in the 2016 Crisis Coach webinar series. If you want to watch previous webinars, you can go to firestorm.com and you can watch the recordings. You can also register for future. These webinar series occur roughly once a month. We do take off a little bit in the summertime for schools. We're pleased to have Kim Fallon with us. Kim is with the Virginia Association of Independent Schools. Kim, over to you, please.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Kim Fallon. I'm the Director of Administrative Programming and Communications for the Association. I just want to welcome you today, and we look forward to hearing more on this topic. And again, we appreciate the support from Firestorm as well.
And Ken, if you want to open your mic, you can probably speak now.
Hi, thanks. Is this, hopefully this is working. This is Ken Mercer, and again, we're delighted to be a part of this webinar series, and I will be following up with each of you participating following today's event. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ken. This is Jim Satterfield. I'm glad to speak with everyone again this month as the series continues on. And these sessions are recorded if you want to share them with others within your school and to focus on the topics. And it creates a virtual training program that's available to you courtesy of the Virginia Association of Independent Schools. Today we're going to think about this concept of visibility vulnerability. And there's some new things I think that you will find of interest, and I also will share with you at the end of today's webinar an opportunity coming up on April the 7th at 2 p.m. That will be another virtual test exercise, so you can take your safety team or your emergency team or your crisis team, put them around the table and have an opportunity to participate in making decisions in a crisis exercise. In that exercise, we're going to be focused on sexting and cyberbullying, and it's obviously a threat and an issue that certainly impacts our young people, and I think you will want to be a part of that. And as we deal with behaviors of concern that are found in schools. You see the target that's up there, and we think about that and want to figure out, are you a target? And as you think about the exposures that each of our schools have, and the example of the exercise is certainly one, and we have talked about active shooter, we've talked about a variety of different things. And so I would ask you to stop and think, and this is a good question for you to ask your team, what keeps you up at night? What are you concerned about in terms of the exposures that could occur within your school? And as we think about those issues, it's going to lead us into the visibility that we have. Certainly, many of the reports that we've seen come out of schools over the years with a variety of different topics place us as the primary target and looking at, and that's going to focus attention on our school and on our students and our parents. So if you think about it, what information is out there that you could know? And we've talked in the past about creating intelligence networks, and we're going to spend a little bit of time on that, at least to reference that area back, but it's an opportunity for you to continue to build your plan to be aware. So if you think about the fact that someone knows, do you know? There's information out there, and sometimes it just gets stopped, that big green bar in the center, and it doesn't flow all the way over to you to deal with it. And so my question to you is, are you the last to know? If you don't have an intelligence network, you're going to find out that the problem is being talked about within your school, within each of those areas. Now, you take a look at the information and add the insight that you bring to that, the perspective of knowing your students, knowing your school, knowing your plans, and your insight then converts that information into intelligence to better manage. Now, we've shared with you some of the statistics here, and I just want to score those again to emphasize a couple of points. One of those being that 80% of the time, if someone has ill intent, someone else knows. 80% of the time. 67% of the time, two or more people know, and when they know, they talk. And where do they talk? They talk on social media. So if you don't have an intelligence program in place, then you would miss that information, and the problem could escalate. The events could occur. And obviously, all of us would want to know if we had a student at risk, whether it was for suicide or bullying or involved. There was a school that we worked with where there was a young man who was sexting last week, and the pictures were up and out, and before the school was even aware that there was an element associated in that area. So knowing those really creates that opportunity for you to intervene. So someone knows, do you? Now, if you don't know, that's going to put you in a situation of where it's a surprise. And is the surprise good or is it bad associated with it? Now, there is a large town, I guess you could call it a small city. It's 200,000 people in Arizona named Surprise. So I guess waking up in Surprise in Arizona is a good thing every single day. But generally, if you're at school, if you're in business, and there's a surprise, it's more of a bad thing. I often joke that the last time a surprise was good, I was 5, and it was my birthday. So as we think about surprise, and we think about it in a management position, it certainly says that we need to be aware of what's going on in this area. Now, we're in a world today where most of us are in disaster denial. You know, that's going to happen in some other school. It's going to happen in some other part of the country. It's not going to affect us. But in today's world, everything is foreseeable, and tomorrow, anyone may be found accountable. Now, there's an expectation that you have care, custody, and control over the students in your school, that the parents assign someone to you, they give their child over, and at the end of the day, they'd like that child back in approximately the same condition that they turned them over to you in. And that's an area where we want to focus and to build our plans. The liability around these things, though, are extremely enhanced when you think about this concept of everything being foreseeable. There's an expectation that you are aware of everything that's going on within your school and your students. And that leads to a level of accountability. Now, in 1993, there was a bombing at the World Trade Center. That was the truck bomb down in the garage. And in that particular scenario, you saw that they found the terrorists and they convicted them in a criminal trial, but there was a civil trial for those that were injured and 2 had died. And in that particular civil trial, the jury awarded damages as follows: 2/3 of the liability to the building owner, 1/3 of the liability to the terrorist. Now, you can say, great country, America. Wait a minute, how come I'm twice as liable as the person who perpetrated the crime? And the rationale was this was an identified risk, an identified vulnerability, and the owners did not do what they needed to do to protect the tenants and the publics within the building. We've just seen a trial go down this week where an ESPN female reporter was photographed illegally in her room. And those photos were posted out on the internet from a stalker. And in the trial, the jury, the plaintiff, the reporter, was stating that the hotel had a responsibility to her, to protect her, and to see that that situation didn't happen. In that trial, they awarded 49% of the damages against the hotel and 51% against the stalker. Again, this concept that anyone may be found accountable in this area. We also note that in responding to the crises and disasters, as we do on a regular basis, that if you're explaining, you're losing. So talking about, well, it really isn't our fault, it really isn't that type of a situation, that's going to not work well, because a parent is going to be looking at you to protect their child. And you obviously want to make sure that that's done. So when we think about crisis management and crisis communications, it's a different type of an area than what you would normally think about. When you are promoting your school and as you have prospective parents and coming out and sharing what the culture is and what your mission statements are and what you're emphasizing and supporting, all of those messages, you want to get that out to a wide of an audience and as broad of an audience as you possibly can. In a crisis, we're going to have some different aspects of how we're going to communicate. We're going to talk about that some, and we're going to talk about some of the things that are going on behind the scenes. So there really is a difference about what has happened in a crisis and how you respond. And when you look at the events that have occurred, how you respond in many cases can create a second crisis. And so we're going to give you some insights there, and it really relates back to the theme of today's session, which is visibility, vulnerability. The crisis is generally always very short-lived. It's the consequences that are not. So as you think about what you're going to say and what you're going to do, those become extremely important. Now, I'll share with you that almost everything you learn initially in this crisis will be wrong. And you're going to be forced to make decisions based upon wrong information and start to communicate. And so from that standpoint, you have to be very careful and state only factual items and state those directly to your target audience and not through the media and third parties. So that opens up a door for us to talk about the media just briefly. Now, as you probably have been following the election campaign this year, you see a great deal of conflict. And conflict always accelerates attention within any particular area. And so there is a conflict bias that the media has. If they can find a conflict, they're going to take advantage of it because they're looking for ratings, because rating means more advertisers, and more advertisers means more money. And so this is a situation that you always want to be able to communicate directly with your students, with your parents, with your faculty, and with your staff. You don't need that person in the middle to relay the messages. And what you find in the media environment is they go to one party to get a statement, then they go to the other to ask how do you respond, then go back to the first. And this kind of ping-pong match back and forth creates that conflict because conflict is what they're driving to. Some of us grew up with reporters like Walter Cronkite, who stood for more integrity and more control in the flow of information. Today, we're in the entertainment business when we think about the media and how these things are reported. So one of the things that we're going to share with you in a few minutes is a strategy to help you communicate directly in each one of these events. So understanding as we go into this area to talk about visibility and the vulnerabilities that it creates, there's media conflict, whether it's the local newspaper, the local television, the local radio station. That's the conflict that they're going to be focused on. So we've said a couple of times visibility. Let me go back. That went a little faster than I wanted it to. The visibility vulnerability. Now you see me, now you don't. So when you think about visibility, it's trying to pick out where you are and what's going on. In many cases, visibility can be good. If we're trying to show the academic achievement that we've had in our school, if we're showing the values that our school stands for, the success that your students have with college admissions or even athletic success or other areas of support, that visibility is extremely positive. There are other times that that visibility makes you the target. You're going to be the one in the school where that pressure will start to come down directly on you as a result of those elements that are attached. And that's really where we want to start to talk about visibility as a vulnerability in this area. Now, there are two things that can trigger visibility vulnerability, and let's explain both of those, and then we'll go into a little more depth on each of those topics. The first is that when you're in a situation, you've had a bad event, there's been a crisis, there's been something that brings that unusual attention to your school. It places you at risk because there's going to be more scrutiny, there's going to be more attention delivered onto the school to find those problems. And then it will, as they start to dig, you'll see more stories coming in associated with who you are and what you do. So the first portion of a definition about visibility vulnerability is the attention that you receive in an event or a crisis will place that magnifying glass over you. The second type of visibility vulnerability is more of your seeing out, where the first is seeing in, the second is seeing out. If you can't identify that information that's publicly available, we responded to a school where there was a difficulty. It was a private school, an independent school, and the teacher stormed out of the classroom and left the students alone. And so when the students went home for the day, they talked to the parents about it, and they started doing research on this teacher to see if there were anger issues, and found that a number of years ago he had posted a statement that he felt like killing these fourth graders sometimes in that particular to deal with the problems that he was finding. So obviously the parents were upset, even though that happened with that posting prior to him being at the school, prior to being hired, but it was information that was publicly available that the school didn't know about. And it comes back again to that concept, if you're explaining, you're losing. So if there's information, you need to know what's going on out there and be aware of it in advance. That's your seeing out. The visibility vulnerability in the first is the seeing in. So let's look at an example of what might come in. Now, when you look at this picture, it looks like there's just lots of dots out there, and one of those dots is your school. Which dot is it? Gosh, it's kind of hard to see which one might our school be. But if something occurs, suddenly the dot might change colors. And if I ask you to find the red dot on this screen, my thoughts are, hey, I can pick that red dot out of all of those dots that are laying out there very, very quickly. Now that's going to change the visibility that we have. Before, we were just another school out in the market, and it would be hard to know if that was related to us or someone else. And now the screen should be back, and you can't find the school again, at this point. There isn't a visibility vulnerability. But if you have a crisis, if you have an event that brings a negative exposure to your school, picking your school out is going to become much easier, and the red dot's back. But really, it's not just the fact that there's one red dot out there among all those white and gray ones that are on the screen. It's that if you find yourself in a crisis, if you find an event where there has been a child that's been harmed, or more than one, or a scandal associated with your school, that red dot's going to grow really big, and it's going to dominate the observations of everyone around your school. And suddenly, just like the dot has now hopefully spread across your screen, your school dominates everything that's being said. It completely changes the paradigm associated with what you're looking for and what you want to do. So this first area that I wanted to talk about is to show you that in a crisis, in a situation, you have vulnerability merely because it occurred. And that vulnerability grows, and it will quickly grow. Because what will happen when someone finds a story on the internet, it'll get accelerated and passed to someone else, and that in turn starts to increase the awareness and the SEO, the search engine optimization. So if you send a link to somebody else, did you see this? That's going to, in essence, bring it higher on the search engines for anyone looking at those areas. So this idea that there's a visibility vulnerability that we need to address is what my attempt to show you with the images that you've seen. Now, the second part of that definition that we talked about was who knows? And that's your ability to listen to what's being said or to look at a particular person or an event or a location. So who knows about what's going on? And what I would tell you is your people know. Students know about other students, parents know, and we responded again to a crisis just recently where parents were calling and telling the school strategic information about the situation and how it was unfolding. Also, the media certainly is listening and looking at these types of things and making comments, and social media is going to be the driver and the common theme in that source. Now, if you don't have a program to monitor social media, if you're not using tools, and this is different than doing a Google search or looking at a particular area, you're not going to be able to fit those pieces of the puzzle together. And we talked when we did the exercise with the active shooter last month about getting a behavioral snapshot, looking at a particular student who had a problem and trying to fit all of those pieces together. This knowing about what's going on in your school is a critical element. And if you don't have an intelligence network, you're going to lose that capability in time and not be able to monitor and track those. So who knows? The answer is a lot of people know. And the expectation is that you will know because you're listening and looking to put those puzzle pieces together. So if we take a step back, how do you know what you don't know? First of all, that piece of the pie that's listed there that says what you know is pretty clear. You know a lot about what's going on. You know the names of your students, you know their addresses, you know the names of the parents, you know your teachers and faculty. There's a bunch of things you know you don't know about them. And you can start to think about what those are. But you'll notice that largest portion of this chart is what you don't know, you don't know. And the more uncertainty that is out there, the less that you know or have a way to identify, the higher your risk comes up. So when we ask very early in today's webinar, what keeps you up at night, that orange sector on the particular chart that you're seeing is one of the key elements that you should be thinking about what you don't know, you don't know. And that's where the intelligence network and that portion of the visibility, vulnerability comes into a key element. Now, everybody has done at least some type of a risk assessment or a vulnerability threat assessment for your school, or a security assessment. I was speaking with one of our principals in Texas this morning about going to the school and doing a security assessment there, and walking the school and identifying what they need to have in place so that they could be better prepared. We did a survey late last year of, I think, 500 schools, and the results came back around this whole concept of being surprised. Do you currently use external intelligence to identify potential threats? 37% of the schools said, yes, we do. 30% said, we don't know, and 30% said no. So it was 30 yes, 30 don't know, and 37% said no. So 67% of the schools that were involved didn't have a clue about what was going on within their school. And so, as we talked about on the surprise slide earlier, having a surprise come in is generally not a positive one. So when you think about the vulnerability and threat assessments that you've done, about the all hazards approach, sit down and think of each one of those dimensions. And we covered this in an earlier webinar this year about identifying what are the warning signs, what are the indicators that that particular exposure may be coming to bear. Now, it's obviously very easy to see when we think about weather. You get the weather report. You know, while we're doing this in March, it's getting ready to be beautiful weather in Virginia, and Kim had shared that, in fact, I think it's going to hit 80 degrees there this week, and it's just spectacularly beautiful. But you could follow that weather forecast in the winter months to see that there's going to be a snowstorm or an ice storm, or in the summer there might be thunder showers, or even if there's a tornado in the area. But if there is a tornado that's not a weather event, but a human event, an event that someone is at risk, someone has a substance abuse problem, or someone has domestic violence at home, or someone is being bullied in your school, or there is inappropriate contact going on between students and teachers, that's a different type of a tornado. It's the type that can certainly be a significant and a material impact. So I'd like you to start to think about how you use intelligence, how you gather information, add your insight into it to create intelligence to make a difference. So how do you predict your school's next crisis? And the answer to that is you build an intelligence network. Look at how that's being created. Now, the intelligence network is a combination of things. It could include the social media that we've talked about a great deal here today. It could also include having an anonymous reporting system so that it's easy to have messages coming in that you can then filter into your decision process. And in today's world, that needs to be a combination not only of a phone number or a paper suggestion box, but a text message reporting or an app that your students can have, and parents, so that information has the ability to come into you anonymously to improve that awareness. You also want to have training within your school around identification of behaviors of concern, so that we find that student who used to participate and who is not participating in class, or whose grades are being going down, or who maybe show signs of bullying occurring to them, or domestic violence in their home. All of those things come in to build that intelligence network, and it needs to be a key portion of your strategy. So let's now move from this intelligence, and we've talked about visibility and vulnerability, to say, what do we do now, and how does it come together? Well, it's really not crisis management as much as it is consequence management. We're in the middle of an emergency. We're going to follow the standard protocol. You're going to lock down, lock out, shelter in place, and evacuate. And you have those, and that individual emergency can be very, very short. But managing the consequences are going to become extremely critical. And that's going to help determine, is this going to define who our school is, or will something else define who we are? Now, you also know that you will be wrong. You're forced in a crisis to make decisions between two bad alternatives. It's not as if, hey, there's a great choice and a bad choice, which do you want to do? My grandfather had a funny line as I was growing up, which would you rather have, or whipping? And I would go, okay, I think I can figure this one out, Granddad. I think I'll go for the non-whipping option here associated with it. But there's a tool that you might use, and it's called OODA, observe, orient, decide, and act. And we've talked about this in an earlier webinar, but just to bring it back up, you have to observe what's going on around you. That's that intelligence network. Orient yourself where you are relative in it, decide what you're going to do, and then you have to take action, and there's continuous feedback within it, because you're going to find that most of what you know early in a crisis is wrong. And so you need to have that continual feedback loop, or you're going to lose sight of it. So in this area, you need to understand what's occurring. You need to decide what you need to do. You need to act. You must monitor what's going on and adjust, because you're not going to be able to keep all those things from falling if you're not adjusting your strategy to the changes that are occurring within it. Now, when we think about response processes and decisions, we would encourage you to always think about the predict, the plan, and the perform. The predict is to understand what the consequences are. What are the implications? What's going to happen next? Plan, what are you going to do? And then perform, because you can't just gather information. You're going to have to take actions. You're going to have to make communications. And we've been focusing today a lot on the both the incoming and outgoing messaging that we've been discussing. And so those become action priorities for us. Now, here's a helpful hint. When you find yourself in a crisis, you want to take notes. You want to jot down the facts. What's the time that you learned it? What's the source that you learned this from? And is it verified or not? One of the founders of Firestorm, Susie Laughlin, is an expert at making sure that she's got all the notes in the crisis situation. And she keeps a binder with her, so she's writing down as that information coming in. So you'll later learn, where did the information come from? When did it happen? Did we have an independent verification of that within it? So if you find yourself in a crisis, take out a piece of paper, start jotting down what you know, and then shifting that over. And then as you decide these action priorities, you assign them, you have a specific follow-up time, and you get a confirmation that it's completed. And you will also identify some things that you'll want to do later. You're not always going to implement everything at this particular point in time. And helpful questions that we find that work on here, that work through this process is, what do you know? Are you concerned? If so, about what? What's your plan? What are you going to monitor? How are you going to monitor it? Who's going to be doing the monitoring? What are you going to communicate? How are you going to get that message out? If you look at these things, they will certainly help you if you find yourself in that type of a vulnerability position. So we're going to go and just give you a couple of more thoughts here and then give you some directions. This is a communications process that we would encourage you to do with your parents now, and it's the Firestorm Transparency Communications Commitment. Communications, like preparedness, is a continuous improvement process. We don't have everything right the first time we sat down on it. And communications with the media in a crisis won't benefit your students, your parents, your faculty, your staff, or the school. So we would recommend that you inform your appropriate stakeholders. And there we're looking at parents, students, faculty, staff, and board of alignment with the following commitments. One, communicate only directly with the parents and students, faculty, and staff and board, and not through the media after a crisis event. You remember the game that you used to play where you would say something to the person next to you and they would say something to that person and carry that all around the circle? And when the message comes back to you, it's not the message that you started out with. This is the reason why you want your parents to know and your students to know that you're going to speak directly to them if there is a crisis event. You're going to communicate coordination and compliant information with all appropriate stakeholders. What do we need to know? What do we need to do? You're committed to protecting all personal student, parent, faculty, staff information. You can't talk to one parent about another student. You can only talk to them about their student. You're going to communicate only after the crisis events are stabilized and the threats are controlled. If we're in the middle of an event and something bad is happening, the safety of our students is our highest priority. Then you're going to communicate with authorities directly in any event where the safety or health of a student is believed to be at risk. We as from academics know that you have a high responsibility, that if you have reason to believe that a child is at risk in an environment that's unsafe, that you have to notify the authorities, and that element plays here. And finally, that you're going to inform all appropriate stakeholders of all channels of communication associated. So as we look at those items, that's an area that we want you to understand and establish in advance. You create an environment where people understand what are the indicators. And I put up here some cyber breach indicators to take you a chance to think about things besides weather and to think about other things that you should see. And many times we find about a cyber breach because the problem the user first identified. So I want you to think about that creatively in other ways. And you not only need to do that, you have to have an activation matrix. If you see something occurring in sharing, this activation matrix that I have up, again, is about cyber breach and having an opportunity here to have that escalation moving through a level 1 to a level 2 to a level 3. But this could have been equally about a violence episode within your school. And having a plan that has specific activities at each one of the 5 stages of activation: pre-action, onset, impact assessment, response and recovery, and post-disaster. Those are the elements that you want to have spelled out, whether this was workplace violence or bullying or safety in any particular area. And again, this particular charge relates back to cyber breach. Now, we're not going to go through the next 5 slides, but I'm going to show them to you very quickly just to give you an idea that there are standards, there are approaches that let you evaluate the maturity of your response. This is, again, is a cyber risk response maturity model, but we could do one on workplace violence or continuity or crisis management. But risk management and oversight, that's going to be a particular element, and it relates to all the things that are going into your school. Threat intelligence and collaboration would be the second dimension. The third would be the identification that it's actually occurring. How do you know now? You've done the awareness, now how do you know that it's about to happen? Then who are you dependent on for the actions that you're going to take? And then finally, how you manage that incident that occurred and how you recover it. So maturity models are in place and standards in each of these areas, and I would encourage you to think about those. So what are our next steps? First, under Predict, you should start to establish this intelligence network. You want to do awareness and prevention training within your school. That's a key element to prepare you. Do a security assessment. Understand what the threats and exposures are that you're facing. Develop a crisis response and communications plan with message maps. What are you going to do if this occurs? What are you going to communicate? It's easier to edit your messages than it is to create them from scratch. And then finally, under Perform, conduct training around awareness, around reporting, getting those elements in place. I would encourage you to put on your calendar April 7th, it will be at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, a 2-hour virtual exercise so you can put your team around the table. And our focus in that exercise will be on sexting and cyberbullying. It's an opportunity for you to experience as you became aware of an event, first to be able to recognize it, and second to figure out what it is you're going to do in these areas. Those are 2 very great threats that are consistent with what we talked about in the exercise last month around workplace violence with active shooter. Here is another serious threat that behaviors of concern can be used to identify those intended areas. I would also encourage you to look at your insurance and current response plans. There are now insurance coverages that can protect the school, that can provide assistance, and you want to make sure that your plans now align to standards and best practices before these events occur. And finally, then, we're creating a user group for those that are working in the areas of behavior of concern so that you can participate with others that are making the same types of decisions that you're faced with in each of these areas. There will be a brief on today's webinar, and you can go to Firestorm.com and then download that brief, and it will talk about visibility, vulnerability. And again, this webinar is being recorded so that you can share it with others in your school, because I know this is spring break week for many of you in Virginia, and this might be a good opportunity to pick everyone back up. I'd like to thank the Virginia Association of Independent Schools for being with us today. And Kim was having some difficulty with the internet going down and up, and so Bill, if you will turn on her microphone or come off mute. Kim, if you have any insights that you want to share with us, feel free to go ahead.
Thank you so much. I actually am here in person and live. Just some really great information. I love the part about communicating only directly with parents, students, and faculty. That whole slide was just, I think, critical to everything that our schools really need in terms of communicating the information. So really fabulous work. Thank you so much, Jim, and again, thanks to Firestorm for your support.
Well, we're glad to have you on today, Kim. Brian, do you want to make any comments today?
Hi, Jim. I look forward to speaking to each of you over the next couple of days following the event. And just to piggyback and reiterate what Kim said, a good test is if you are asked to respond in the media, before you say anything, ask why. To whom is your audience, and why are you talking to media? If you can communicate directly to your audience, there's no need to speak to the media. So just before you talk, ask why. What is your message, and do you need to use this way to get it across? So I look forward to talking to each of you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Glad to have you on today, Ken. And we also had sitting in today on the webinar Harry Rulin. Harry is one of the other founders of Firestorm. And Harry, if you are on mic-wise, feel free to speak. If you're not, because I don't see a speaker next to you, a mic next to your name, jump in. If not, we'll continue to move on. Harry, do you have any comments you want to make?
I am on. Can you hear me?
We can. You're perfect.
Well, thank you. This is such an important topic, and Firestorm does a lot of communications training and other things with school executives and others. And the world of communications changes every day. The rate of change in the way that our constituents are receiving information, and not only receiving but publishing information, changes so rapidly. And I think the important thing to remember, I'm 52 years old. The way that I still write thank you notes, with a pen, and those kind of concepts are being lost every day to a new generation of your customers. In other words, so the parents who are sending their kids to your schools, they're getting younger and younger. Soon the millennials will be sending their kids to your schools, and it's important to remember the way they communicate, the way they receive information, the way they process information is very different from the way that from your last generation of students. So you've got to be constantly evolving your program. And visibility used to be always, there was that expression that no press is bad press. That is no longer the case.
Harry, thanks for sharing and jumping in. So we've got a lot to think about in our schools. It's a different world and a different emphasis, and this media conflict bias makes a big difference as those elements come together. If you'd like to listen to this recording again or share with others, you can go to firestorm.com. If you've got a question, send us an email at webinars@firestorm.com or give us a call at 800-321-2219. Thank you for all that you're doing in your schools every day to make a difference. We very much appreciate that and the support, and we thank the Virginia Association of Independent Schools for the great job that they do every day. Thanks, everyone. Have a great spring, and don't forget that April 7th virtual exercise on sexting and cyberbullying. Goodbye.